Yeah,
Okay.
pretty much.
Cool.
So, my name is Monk Rowe, and we're in the Jazz Archive at Hamilton College talking to Greg Thomas, Hamilton class of '85. And I should tell you that I have described you as a jazz entrepreneur.
I like that.
Do you like that?
I do.
Because I wasn't quite sure. I know I'm aware of some of the things you've done, but probably not all. But you're a person that got bit by the jazz bug.
Yes, big time.
Okay.
Big time. Even before Hamilton, in high school is where I got bit by the jazz bug. And that happened, I actually know the moment. I know the moment it happened. It was at a Tottenville High School stage band concert.
Mm-hmm.
Mason Ash, also a graduate of Hamilton, class of '85. He and I went to junior high school together in Staten Island, Dreyfus Junior High School. Then we went to high school together. Because it was junior high school, we actually went to ninth grade at Dreyfus. So we went to Hamilton. We went to Tottenville in 10th grade. So at the end of our sophomore year, 10th grade, we attended this stage band concert. And they played some Spiral Gyra, they played some Basie, they played some Steely Dan, and it just blew us away. It blew us away. We loved it. The expression, the way the instruments seemed to talk and speak to each other and express emotions. I mean, I might not have put in those terms then.
Yeah.
You know, it was just exciting, you know. So at the end of the concert, they were sitting there, and Mason says, I got to pick up my guitar again, because he played the guitar. And I said, I got to pick up something, because I never played. I mean, I played recorder, you know, in elementary school, but nothing else. So I decided to pick up the alto saxophone. So I borrowed an alto, a Selmer Bundy, from the school. I was fortunate to go to a high school that had a really strong music program. So they had a closet that had all kind of instruments. So I took a alto sax home and started to learn. And in my junior year, I was in the concert band and the concert band, that was the main band. And my goal was to get into the stage band that first inspired me. By my senior year, I got into the stage band on alto, and also the symphonic band that played, I guess, light classics.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you ran into Clark Terry here.
Oh my, you are fast forwarding to the next epiphany. Oh man, yeah, Clark Terry. This was in April of 1994. And, you know, it's funny, last night at the concert featuring Dick Hyman and Randy Sankey and a group led by Hyman and featuring yourself, I got a chance to see for the first time in 30 years Don Cantwell, who I studied saxophone with here, and who was the head of the Hamilton Jazz Band. And so he made arrangements for Clark to come. Now he reminded me last night that the fraternity, is it Delta Upsilon? Is it
I think that's it.
DU?
Yeah.
That's, at least they were based down at Bundy then. I used to hang out with those guys. I lived in Bundy. I wasn't a member of the fraternity, but they were, you know, creative guys, artistic, and a bunch of them. We formed a band called Delta Bop. And let's see, just to go through a quick, before we get to Clark, Delta Bop had Joe Duffus on drums, Bill Denser on trumpet and piano, Jamie Rind, who wasn't a member of the fraternity, but he played piano. Mason played guitar. Paul Williams on bass, and there was another gentleman, blonde hair, who played trumpet also, but I don't think he was in the group. I don't remember his name. But anyway, Mr. Cantwell says that that fraternity, in part, made it possible for Clark to be here. They came up with some funding, which I didn't remember. So Mr. Cantwell made arrangements for Clark to come. We played his own arrangements with his big band. I mean, of his arrangements that he used for his big band. And I remember, I mean, I always did when there were certain speakers who came and certain musicians who came, I would always do like really serious research on them, listen to their recordings and find out about them. So I read about Clark Terry, and Clark Terry, I mean, Basie, Ellington, Quincy Jones, you know, he had his group with Bob Brookmeyer, you know, I mean, just, you know, classic recordings from the 60s with the Oscar Peterson Trio, you know, just, I mean, and just a phenomenal trumpet player, you know, a master, and because of his education work, a grandmaster, because he has not only demonstrated mastery of the instrument, but he's passed on the legacy to others who themselves are masters and became masters. I mean, his first student was Quincy Jones. Miles Davis looked up to Clark.
Right.
You know. So anyway, what I remember from that event was we went to dinner, and I think it was the night before we went to dinner, and it was myself, Don Cantwell, and a few other members of the band, and I was sitting next to Clark, and I was just, I couldn't say anything. I was just, you know, in awe of him. So he's like, yeah, great, so tell me about yourself, you know, Made me feel comfortable and relaxed, which was good because I was to share a melody with him. So we got a chance to play rehearsal, but it was nothing like being in a chapel and actually playing. And I really describe it almost like a mystical experience, because in the chapel, when you play, I mean, the acoustics are wonderful in the chapel, Hamilton College Chapel. So it felt like his sound was surrounding me like a cloud of joy or something like that. It was just, I mean, it was literally like being in heaven. And I'm telling you, from that point, my playing improved automatically in this sense. I began to project more of my own personality. You know, I wasn't holding back as much. It's like, be yourself. Say what you got to say. I mean, hey, I played with Clark Terry, so why not? You know?
That's a powerful moment.
Absolutely.
And playing with, beside the fellows from that generation, is indescribable. It's like this really intense education.
Oh yeah.
And sometimes you don't realize it till
right.
a little bit after, and you reflect on what that was like.
Right. I mean, it's like that's truly living jazz history. You know, I mean, he not only played with the greats. I mean, I had a recording in high school of him, and it was a bootleg. It was a Dinah Washington recording, and it had Clark, Clifford Brown, and Maynard Ferguson playing together.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was just incredible. So, I mean, I knew who he was. So, I'll give you a quick anecdote. I was very close with Duke Ellington's nephew, Ruth Ellington's son, Michael James, who was one of the top proteges of Albert Murray, who I presume we'll talk some about, I hope. And he would tell me, pause it for a second. Okay. So Michael James would always tell me these stories about his time, not only with Duke, which was enough, but, I mean, I think Johnny Hodges was his godfather. I mean, he would hang out with Paul Gonsalves. He was at the recording session that Duke did with Train. I mean, this stuff like that. So he told me he was close to Papa Joe Jones. And he told me that one time Papa Joe and he, I think they were at the Vanguard, and they were checking out, what's his name, Philly Joe Jones. And what Papa Joe Jones would say to Mike is, hear that? that's it. That's me. That's this one, that's that one. And saying that they all were on stage with him at the same time because those influences come through. So when you talk about Clark Terry, I mean, you're talking about someone who embodies what the music is about.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just a profound experience for me.
I recall being surprised, I guess, early on when I started doing these interviews, when a person of Clark's stature, a number of them, would basically hit me up for a gig afterwards, after the interview. Now, that sounds too pejorative, but it made me realize that these gentlemen, as much as they were revered by you and I and
Mm-hmm.
the jazz-loving public, were still trying to make a living.
Absolutely.
And they were not, I think I had this idea that a guy like Clark Terry and those fellas, they got it made now. They could choose their gigs and stay home if they want, and it usually was not true.
Right.
They still had to work.
That's right. Yeah. Definitely.
So going from Hamilton, what was your major here?
Public policy, which
Mhm.
combined government, economics,
Yeah.
and philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And my minor was music. Well, we went through the history of European classical music, and but also we played in different ensembles. And this group I mentioned before, Delta Bop, we did a winter semester where the project was to play and do a concert,
Yeah.
which we did, which was
Mhm.
cool, a lot of fun. Yeah.
Did you ever play any of the frat parties and that kind of stuff?
Occasionally. I
Yeah.
remember one time we played a frat party, and it was so loud, and there were no monitors,
Yeah, yeah.
so I couldn't even hear myself.
Right.
But they seemed to be having a good
Yeah.
time, so.
Yeah, they can get pretty wild.
Yeah.
Did you, when you left here,
Mm-hmm.
did you know what you wanted to do?
Mm. Well, while I was here, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, which is one of the reasons I chose public policy. That seemed to be practical public policy,
Mhm.
dealing with the legislative process, various issues, that deal with the governmental and economic and social dimension of things, with certain ethical issues underpinning it and all of that kind of stuff in terms of the different disciplines that comprise that interdisciplinary major. But by the time I was a senior, I didn't necessarily want to go that route. I didn't want to go to law school. So many of my friends were going that route. So I really, frankly, wasn't sure when I left what I wanted to do. No, I wasn't really sure.
Mhm.
No.
But you found a way to work in jazz as a writer, as a
Mhm.
producer.
Right.
How did that sort of evolve?
Well, let's see. Well, the writer is first. Back in 1989, there was a publication called Urban Profile that was started by Keith Clinkscales and Leonard Burnett. Their first magazine. They later went on to jointly put out Five magazine, Savoy magazine. They both have very successful careers. Lynn Burnett is now the chief, I think, revenue officer. They create these titles for Uptown magazine, which is based in Harlem, but that covers goings on for, we would say, the upper middle class black society, black community in major cities, Atlanta, Chicago, New York, like that. So for this publication, I wrote an article, and it was an advocacy piece. Why black folks need to support jazz. So that was my very first professional piece. And I freelanced, actually in '91 began as a staff writer at the City Sun, which was a black-owned newspaper in Brooklyn. That was a very good newspaper, defunct after a few years. But I mean, I've written for the Guardian Observer, for various online publications from Salon, The Root, Africana.com when it was around, Black World Today, and print publications. I was a New York Daily News jazz columnist for a few years. Savoy magazine I wrote for, American Legacy magazine I did some writing for, and a number of others. So that the writing has been, I guess, the longest thing, in considering the way the internet has upended publishing and various industries, you know, not just publishing, but every industry really. Certainly being a journalist, unless you are one of the holders of a coveted staff position at a, you know, really well-heeled publication, it's really hard to make a living as a freelance writer. So I've always had to supplement, you know, teaching and doing other things.
Right. I've often wondered, is it harder to make a living as a jazz musician or as a jazz journalist?
It's relative. I would say it's, these days, it's probably as hard to be a jazz musician, because you have situations where you have so many musicians and so relatively few places to play, and particularly places that pay anything decent. I mean, there was a time I hear about, I read about, or I've read about and been told about, because I've done a bunch of interviews myself for the Jazz Museum, the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, their Harlem Speak series.
Right.
I co-produced that and did dozens of interviews. And you hear these accounts of, you know, clubs here and there, you know, in various cities, and how it was just a part of the whole, you know, the whole scene. That changed big time, 60s, 70s, and 80s. You have these ups and downs. You have these waves, of course, of where jazz is more or less recognized and appreciated, but it's rough for jazz musicians. I mean, especially when you have so many jazz musicians, young jazz musicians coming out of jazz programs. There's more jazz musicians coming out of jazz programs than there are bands, well, not bands, but I'd say places, venues for them to work, I think. So that's problematic.
Yeah, Winard Harper was saying the same thing, and it's rather ironic that, in one sense, jazz has become much more popular and healthy in academia.
Yeah.
But that curve going up is sort of matched by the curve going down.
Right, right. So I think the key would be to make sure that those students are prepared. Say, listen, it's great to be an instrumentalist and to know how to do that and to be as good as you can with that. But that in the current marketplace, you need to definitely have to be well-rounded, which a liberal arts education is supposed to give you, and to have some specific skill sets that you can apply in other areas other than music. But even in music, there are any number of things that are needed. Certainly, fundamentally, these people will hopefully be jazz fans all of their life, and bring others into the music, you know, even if it's just their own children. But there's other things that's needed. You know, when you talk about an industry, you have different parts of that industry and how people fit. You know, musicians often, you know, disparage critics. I consider myself a jazz writer, though, and I'm a jazz critic to a certain extent. I think of it in a neutral to a positive sense, but because critics are so bedeviled by a negative connotation, I think I lean towards jazz journalist, you know.
Okay.
But I mean, but there's a function for that. There's a critical function, which basically is as the go-between between the musicians and the public. Now, some musicians would say, well, You know, we don't need that. I mean, the public, if they hear it, then they can form their own impression.
Mm-hmm.
Well, sometimes they might not hear it unless there's someone or vehicles, publications, individuals who are promoting it, publicizing it,
Mm-hmm.
you know, letting folks know. So the critical function is to take those, you know, the artist intent plus the codes and standards and traditions of the particular art form, and then translate all of that in a way that a general public, a general layperson, can understand it and relate to it and hopefully connect with it. I mean, that's the critical function, I think. So it serves a purpose, but getting back to my other point, I mean, there are people needed on the business side. You know, you need people to own venues. You need people to manage artists. You have venues that have their own functions, you know, that are played in a venue. There's so many levels. So there's a lot that can be done. You know, if you go on to law school, you can do entertainment law, you know,
Right.
and help out. So there's all kind of ways of being involved
Yeah.
with the music and continuing to support it, other than just by being a working musician.
Yeah, and I'd like to think that the people in those positions do better at it if they were musicians, and or if they are musicians, or if they.
I would think so, because there's a certain sensitivity that you have. There's a certain appreciation that you have of what it actually takes to become good at playing an instrument.
Mhm.
And it takes devotion and dedication, like anything. But you're talking about something that, you know, there's a learning curve to it.
As a organizer or booker of gigs,
Hmm.
you must have these situations where you'd love to pay this particular musician some good bread.
Yeah, man. Absolutely.
But you have economic realities that you're
Right.
dealing with, the clubs and all that stuff, so that must be a
Yeah.
little awkward at times.
Yeah, it is. It is. I've been in a position where my production company, I have a production company with my partner and wife, Jewel Kings Thomas, called G&J Productions. And we've produced in any number of places. Wainwright House in Rye, New York. Aaron Davis Hall in Harlem. Jenny's Supper Club, which is below the Red Rooster in Harlem. Mist Harlem on 116th between Lenox and 5th. We did a jazz Sunday brunch there. And any number of other places. Friars Club also. And so we've been in a position where we've paid ours directly, but sometimes we work with venues, and it's the venue's responsibility to pay the musicians. And you always run up against the economic reality of, okay, the musician, you have the musician's fees, and then the venue and the producers have other costs. There's marketing costs. There's the cost of, if you're in a venue that serves food, you've got servers, and you've got food costs, and you've got overhead, and all that stuff is taken into consideration. So sometimes you just cannot afford to hire certain musicians. And there are times when you have to give what you can afford to give, but that's not necessarily what artistically the real value.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's some fabulous players that we've had, and they need to work, and we have a certain budget, and sometimes that's just what it comes down to. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Sometimes it does hurt.
Then the musician has to decide, well, I could do this, or I could stay home, or,
Right.
you know.
Or maybe not do it and get something better.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Did you ever have musicians say, okay, I'll do it, and then get something better, and then... I know it happens around here.
Okay. There've been some side men. In other words, the main artist who's worth, I'm trying to think, I don't think there's been the lead artist who's done that. But some of their side men.
Right.
They've had to replace side men
Yeah.
because the side man
Yeah.
goes off and
Oh,
does other
Greg, you
things.
know the drummer I was having on board?
Exactly, right.
Right. Some things never change, doesn't matter
Mhm.
where you are.
Right.
I wanted to talk about I read this about you. Under the banner of race and jazz,
Ooh, okay.
to shed light on the way that race has bedeviled the jazz discourse and the actual lives of jazz musicians.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's a topic that gets written about a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm wondering what you're thinking about it
Do you think?
is at this point.
No, the intent of that series at All About Jazz was to, frankly, to use the issue of race to point the way to culture. Because race, biologically speaking, is an illusion unless you're talking about the human race, which almost sounds like a cliche, but it's true. But race certainly has there's a psychological and social and behavioral dimension to race that's very real, because if you believe, let's say, take you, Mo, if I make certain judgments about you based on the pigment of your skin, or your height, or your weight, or some attribute like that, if I make certain presumptions and then treat you in a certain manner because of that, then you have to then adjust yourself based on my belief and my behavior towards you based on attributes that, in a larger sense, are immaterial and should not be the basis upon judging or assuming certain behaviors or assuming certain values. If you have this skin pigment, therefore you think or behave in a certain fashion. I mean, it sounds absurd, because it is. It is absurd. But I'm leading to the culture piece. But
Okay,
go ahead.
but and also that you can make assumptions about, if we're talking about musicians,
Mm-hmm.
or you're going to be more likely to play in a certain way.
Oh yeah.
You know.
Oh, that's true. But these days, that's usually not the case, because there's such diversity of styles within the music that it's hard to just look at someone and say, well, they play such and such style. That's hard these days,
Yeah.
I'd say. But getting back to what I was saying about race and culture, so race itself, as a biological reality, is an illusion, But because race has become a part of the way people look at things, the way some people look at things, the way people then behave towards others, then that gets in the mix, so you have to deal with that. I think a much better way to look at human interaction, group behavior, values, traditions, practices, modes of passing down those through education, myths and rituals that are related to those things, is culture. So the issue of race it's like the third rail, they say, in American discussion, American discourse. But I was willing to take the risk of dealing with that because, one, I have thought about and read about these issues for decades. I did some graduate work at NYU in American Studies, a doctoral program, in which allowed me to continue my interdisciplinary work that I started here at Hamilton. So I went into more depth in literature and anthropology and history in particular, both the subjects themselves as well as a critical body of work and thought in those areas, which has given me a really broad view of these issues. I know that personally, and this is something I tell in the very first entry into that series, the first essay, which I called, if I remember correctly, Jazz versus Racism. See, the series is Race and Jazz, but Jazz versus Racism was the title of the first piece. So my first line is, jazz helped me to not become a racist, or something along that line. And it told about my time here at Hamilton, where, because I was studying in depth about slavery, enslavement, the Middle Passage, and those details, got angry. I mean, you know, like in the late 70s, while in high school, watching Roots got you angry, you know, but really studying this stuff. So, but what happened is that, and Minister Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam was pretty big at the time, you know, around the time that Jesse Jackson was running for president and that kind of thing. You know, we'd listen to tapes here and that kind of thing. But the thing that never allowed me to jump over the cliff and become a racist, and I don't believe the canard that if you're black you can't be a racist because race is about power relations. I don't buy that. I mean, not that race isn't about power relations, but it's not just about that. You can have a point of view about someone based on their physical attributes. They got a damn thing to do with whether or not you have power over them. Now, if you have some kind of power over them, it becomes worse, which is what black people have had to deal with for a long time. But you can still have a point of view about other people based on those kind of attributes and not have that. So I don't buy that particular argument. So I got to a point where I had to actually make a choice. Am I going to, based on this anger, based on this history, am I going to actually, you know, start to dislike white people, you know? And the thing that didn't allow me to make that leap was the music. Because I loved Phil Woods and his playing. Because I loved Paul Desmond. I loved Zoot Sims. And that was like a shield that protected me against falling prey to that kind of thinking, man.
That's wonderful to hear, and I have, it's not exactly the same, but my introduction to the black race was through music.
Okay.
You know, I grew up in a suburb where there was one African-American student who was sort of probably bussed in from inner city Rochester, and of course he was on the basketball team. And it was my introduction to another race of people was really through Cannonball Adderley and Count Basie.
Okay.
So it's really great to hear that music can
Absolutely
surround this.
Absolutely. And if you would allow me, because how we language things, how we describe things is so important. So I would amend what you just said and say the first time you met a particular ethnic group or cultural group, which some called back in, you know, Ralph Ellison and Albert Merger, Negro Americans, to Black Americans, to African Americans, as some call them, would have been that. Like I said, race is not real in that sense. So I don't believe that there is a black race or a white race. In that same piece that I am talking about, I have a short portion where I talk about Phil Woods, Paul Desmond, Zoot Sims, and I describe their ethnic background. You know, part Jewish, part German, you know. And then I have in parentheses, I say, you know, isn't it like shameful to reduce them to the word white when they have this diversity and variety in their backgrounds? You know what I mean? So I don't use that kind of terminology because I think it reinforces and reinscribes the notion that race is actually real, and I don't buy it.
Yeah. I have a marvelous John Hendricks said I have to show it to you sometime.
No, you have it on the wall here.
Yes.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Okay. Since I'm on camera, you want me to say it?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just read it, and since I visited here before, I was here in 2010 for my 25th class reunion. I remember seeing that, and John Hendricks says, for his Hamilton College Jazz Archives interview, when someone asks me about race, I say, when does it start? John Hendricks,
Yeah.
the master of vocalese. I've had my own interactions with John Hendricks, and I've actually written on his vocalese work, which I think he's the total master of vocalese. And an example of a work like Joy Spring, his vocalese rendition of Clifford Brown's Joy Spring that's performed by Manhattan Transfer on their Grammy Award-winning recording vocalese is a masterpiece of masterpieces in that particular subgenre. So John Hendricks, very learned man, I think he went to law school for a while. He's very well read, and that finds its way into his body of lyrics, vocalese lyrics. But he's also down to earth. He's also got the as they say, the street experience. He's also got he's got all of that. So he's able to bring a full dimension of that, all that into his work.
Well, as getting back to when you produce concerts and so forth, are you conscious of the people that you book in a whole season or for a particular event? And because we both sort of agree that there's no such thing as race, but I can't say this question without it.
Okay.
Are you conscious, like, gee, I have booked almost all white players this season, or I have booked almost all black players this season. When I get the musicians for this Fall Coming Jazz concert, that's been going on for 23 years, and there's been many years where all the musicians were white, partly because they played in a style that our founder, Milt Fillius, liked.
And you find...
I don't know if I have a question here, but I wonder if
race, so-called, is a consideration, either retrospectively or prospectively. Not race per se, because I've hired men, women, black, white, Latino, Asian, and they've been mixtures in the bands, which is always great. But you do have to take a look at fit. When I say fit could be stylistic fit. Fit could be generational. Because who's your audience? As a writer, it's like you got to be aware of who your audience is. So when you're booking, you're producing, who's your audience? Now your audience, in many cases is varied, and a jazz audience is certainly hard to define. But when we book in Harlem, for example, you're usually talking about boomers and older. You got some Gen Xers, you usually don't have a lot of young people, and the young people you do have, either they were introduced to the music by their parents, and the event is just something that they can do that's fun, or they're musicians, and they've studied music. A lot of times those are the things that when you see young people. But, what's your theme? See, one of the things we do for G&J is we have different themes that we use to hang the events on. So instead of just presenting such and such a group led by such and such a person, which we've done also, you have a certain theme that you're fitting groups in for a series. So we had something called Cutting Up, which is based on the cutting contest. So you have the leaders on the same instrument with a rhythm section, and they're playing tunes together, and they're trading fours and trading eights and that kind of thing, It's really fun, but you use the whole competition angle as kind of a marketing tool of sorts. And we've had several of those concerts very successful. In fact, one of them ended up on Dr. Henry Louis Gates's The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, his Peabody and an Emmy Award-winning PBS series, for example. We have one that's called Jazz Plus that allows us to have jazz at the center, but it's jazz plus rock, jazz plus Latin, jazz plus rock, jazz plus classic.
I see.
See, so that's another theme. You also have, we had one that was a singer series that you give it a certain title. So, the question is more for us, how does a particular group fit within or fit underneath the theme we're presenting for the audience we're presenting to? So those are the real main considerations, and certainly because certainly not race, but you do want to have the right fit for what you're trying to present.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And personalities and all that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that, particularly when we've hired young musicians, I realize that I'm going to have to not only just hire and produce an event featuring young musicians, but sometimes actually need to get into a coaching modality with them, in the sense of, hey guys, this is entertainment too. This is entertainment. So you need to communicate with your audience. Maybe you interact and you tell some jokes, or you let them know what song it is, and you give them a context to connect with you and to connect with the music. It's gotta be more than you just getting up there blowing.
Here, listen to Cannonball Adderley,
Oh,
and how and
Yeah.
it's really interesting you say that, because I'm guessing that some of these younger musicians that don't get that may have graduated from jazz schools,
I think so.
and
I think so. Yeah.
they're not getting that.
See, the way it used to be in the music that you learn by the old crafts model, the apprentice model. So, as a beginner, obviously you have to learn your craft. So you're going to learn the basics in music. You're going to learn how to play your instrument, how to play in tune. If you're playing a woodwind instrument like we do, or like I did and you do, you got your long tones. You got to learn your scales in every key. You got to learn your chords. You develop your own personal sound. At least you strive towards that. As a beginner, usually that's not the case because you don't really have a instrumental identity yet. But along the way, you play in bands, so it's not just you playing in your room by yourself on your instrument and shedding it with records, which is important, but you got to play with other people. And through the process of playing with other people, you start to grow because you're on that journey together, and you see how to communicate, listen, respond to other people. But in playing with the apprentice model, I had it where you would get with someone who was at another level and learn from them, and the ideal is when you get a chance to be with a master of the particular art form, so that master is, whether it's verbally through, when you're practicing and they instruct you, or just more psychically, because some leaders don't really explain a lot, but you get it, and oftentimes these masters are not just teaching about music. It's about life. It's about how you comport yourself as a young man or a woman in this field out here. That's one of the things that anyone who's going through that apprentice model, that's what they tell you. They learn so much about life itself, relationships and such. Not just playing music, though, that's primary. So, you have a basic, you have the apprentice, you have a journeyman, you have craftsman and master craftsman. So when you go through that process, you are developing yourself instrumentally, being able to play in a group context, until you get to a point where you yourself, say, are a master on your instrument with your own voice, your own particular approach, influenced. You got those other people on the stage with you.
Yeah.
but you still have your own identity, your own sound, your own particular approach that's expressive of who you are. These days, you have schools that have codified a particular way to learn how to play jazz. And so you have, and they serve their purpose. It's important to have a codification of an art form when you have institutional structures through which people learn how to do things, especially when you don't have, first of all, the number of grandmasters from the golden era is less and less. That's one thing. And you have less and less bands run by masters. There's only a select number of slots in those bands, you know. So when you had the big bands traveling, going on the road, and you have bands, you have all these different venues, you have more opportunity for that. So there needs to be a way for a young person who wants to know how to play to be able to do that. So this serves that purpose. But what has ended up happening in a lot of cases that on a particular instrument, you find a lot of the young players sound very similar. And you also find that they don't seem to, though they may learn the history, you know, the chronological history of the music, and that's a necessary part of their study, they don't necessarily seem to learn that history on the instrument. A lot of times you have artists who will start, if they start in the 50s, that would be good, because the 50s is the epicenter.
Yeah.
You have all these different things. But a lot of times they start in the 60s or the 70s.
We start with Coltrane.
Well, they start with Coltrane, but you got some who start, you know, you got trumpet players, man, who start with Roy Hargrove. And Roy Hargrove was a wonderful player. But Roy Hargrove was checking out Clifford Brown and Fats Navarro and Dizzy, you know. So you need to learn the history and traditions of your instrument. You know, if you're a trumpet player, a jazz trumpet player, then you need to have Louis Armstrong, Roy Eldridge, Dizzy, and there's all kind of people, Buck Clayton, there's all kind of people in there too, you know, who are great players in their own right, who you need to know. But on up, not that you're going to play in Pops' style or Dizzy's style necessarily, but they are central to the development of the idiom. So if you are going to play in the idiom, then you need to understand the continuum of that idiom. It just seems, it stands to reason, you know? But a lot of times young folks are like, well, and this is disturbing to me. Blues, you know, I'll tell you, I'm going to give you an anecdote. That was really something I told you when I was in high school when we played in the stage band, that we played Spyro Gyra. Well, when I was here, I actually started doing some writing when I was here. I wrote for the Spectator. And I remember, I don't know if I did this for the Spectator, but I interviewed Jay Beckenstein, the lead alto player for Spyro Gyra. And I asked him about the blues. Jay Beckenstein says, that wasn't my experience. I don't play the blues. And there was something in me that just got so turned off. Not because I so loved the blues myself, because I had to really get educated on what the blues meant. I had yet to really delve into the work of Ralph Ellison and Albert Murray to find out the meaning of the blues or the meaning of blues music as I did later. But there was something in me that said, that's something, okay, then you have disconnected yourself from one of the founts, one of the tributaries that became jazz, and that still is fundamental to jazz. And I find that these days, a lot of young musicians, they might think, as I did at one time, blues, that's old time, you don't have to do that. Mm-hmm. Well, if you're not going to confront the blues, then how can you call yourself a jazz musician? Really?
I
really?
agree.
All the masters the masters had to deal with the blues. If you're going to talk about free jazz and Ornette Coleman, well, Ornette Coleman was grounded in the blues. You can't listen to Ornette Coleman and not realize that he was marinated in the blues. Okay? Come on, man. Then you got folks who have the audacity to not confront swing. You're talking about fundamental practices and values, because swing is not just a musical practice. Swing represents a value and represents a certain meaning in the cultural dynamic of the music. So if you're not going to deal with blues and swing, not that you have to confine yourself on every song to playing something that's bluesy or swinging on everyone, because there's songs that don't happen like that. Or you might choose, once you learn that, to try to extend or go beyond the tradition or play something else that ain't jazz. That's your prerogative.
Uh-huh.
But if you're going to call yourself a jazz musician and you are not going to confront blues and swing,
Doing yourself a large disservice.
absolutely, and a disservice to a public who may not know jazz history. And if you are either calling yourself a jazz musician or allowing yourself, because you're an instrumentalist, say, to actually be called a jazz musician and you're not that. Kenny G is not a jazz musician. I'm not saying Kenny G can't play. Kenny G has a nice tone on soprano sax, and I don't mean to just, I mean, there's a group of people who just, knee-jerk condemnation of certain people, and Kenny G's one of them. But I'm using him as an example. He plays instrumental pop and instrumental R&B. Let's call it what it is.
Yeah.
There's a market for that, obviously.
Herb Alpert, when I was a kid, he was, in fact, I read a fact recently that Kenny G surpassed Herb Alpert as the largest selling instrumentalist.
Right.
But Herb Alpert, no one called him a jazz musician. He was playing instrumental pop music, and it was very pleasant and stuff. So let's just call Kenny G an instrumental pop musician.
Right, and that's okay, but there are people who get confused. Why did they get confused? Because you had radio stations that were playing things that they called jazz, but that really wasn't jazz. Now you had certain stations that influenced me, like WRVR in New York in the late 70s, that played jazz, what we call jazz, but they also played fusion, which is like a combination of jazz with rock and other elements. Okay. I'm not a purist, though. That's why I say it's okay if you want to play something else. And also because, actually, for me, what they call fusion is something that when I first got into the music, I loved. And what I would do is because interestingly enough, I don't think I've ever articulated this or written this, but what I used to do is, it was more for swing, because I just love swinging, because it was something about, because as a player, being in a context where playing in a band, and you get a certain groove going, and it's so uplifting. And when you're swinging, it's like, when you think about the combination of, a bass player walking, a drummer, riding the cymbal, which all notice these are movement metaphors, the piano player accompanying, and that groove together creates what they call that swing feeling. For a soloist, that's something that you can ride on, that you can fly with, that you can interact with. Maybe you're going to rub up against it where they're here and you're there, but it creates this tension and release and this form of expression and this freedom that's so powerful. So if you're going to not express yourself in that medium and not have elements of the blues, then why would you want to call yourself a jazz musician? Now, I'm not saying that there are not elements of the jazz tradition. What I would say is part of the jazz tradition that counterstated that went another direction, where whether it's the song forms or song stylings, there's a whole part of the music that extended, experimental part and stuff. But they're in part experimenting not only about incorporating other genres of music, from classical to other styles, but it's also a counter statement to what is that tradition, which is valid. I mean, art is about expression, but it's also about statement and counter statement. So that when you, as an artist, are developing your own identity, you incorporate certain people whose style you like or love, and you learn that in the part of you expressing and becoming into your own and with your own identity. And then some that you don't like. And as you develop your own style, you say, well, and that influences you too. So I don't like that. So what I do counters that. I don't really dig that, or I like this. And that's just the nature of the way art is. This is not just music. This is in writing too. I once asked Albert Murray if James Baldwin was an influence on him. And he said, yes, it was an influence. He influenced me in what not to do. I had never thought about it in that way.
Uh-huh. Yeah, you can learn something from things you don't like.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, before we run out of time here, let's
Okay.
talk about Albert Murray a little bit.
Okay. All right. What would you like to know?
Were you influenced by him?
Greatly. I mean, Albert Murray is one of my intellectual heroes, and I consider him a mentor because I knew Mr. Murray. In the early 90s, I wrote him a letter because I had a book project in mind that I wanted to do at the time, where I took a look at his work, the work of John Henry Clark, who was a black American historian on the black nationalist line, and then Lerone Bennett, who was the editor of Ebony magazine and a political writer. So I called him up after writing this letter. He's like, hey man, why you want to put me with those guys? In other words, why you want to do a work where you're looking at me in comparison to them?
He said that to you.
He said that to me, yeah. Why you put me with those guys? But see, Murray was, to some he was very cantankerous, argumentative, but he was at heart a teacher. I mean, he taught at a number of schools, but there were just people who he took under his wing, and he was patient in his professorial and teacherly capacity. So I would go over to his place on 132nd off Lenox Avenue, which those of us who are Murrayites call the spyglass tree. That's one of his phrases. You have the little spyglass. You go into a tree and you have a spyglass that give you, a view of whatever you're looking at in a view or closer view. And the spyglass tree is the name of one of his novels, second novel. I would talk to him. I would interview him. I read his work. He put me on to Michael James, who I mentioned earlier. And Michael and I became very close. So I consider myself a Murrayite in that sense. So his work is fundamental. In fact, I'm about to do some work, some books dealing with his thought in more detail. So he wrote books like The Omni-Americans, which I think if people would take a look at that book and the concept of Omni-Americans more seriously, they would have a richer conception of what being an American means, and they would look much less at race and more towards culture. Okay? Omni-American means all American, but his point largely was that being an American means that you're going to have some kind of mixed mulatto something, most of the time. And that's okay, because most of us, are mixed in some kind of way or another. The genetic work genetics work that Henry Louis Gates is doing through some companies, and these shows that he has on PBS where he looks at the genetic history of usually famous people, shows that these mixtures are just realities. Murray also wrote The Hero in the Blues, which takes a look at the blues and heroism from a literary context. He has Stomp in the Blues, which is like a poetic of the blues, which talks about, you know, the blues kind of every which way, looking at it from a sacred and secular perspective, looking at it from historical territory bands to the icons and heroes of the canon. He also wrote, and this is nonfiction I'm talking about, autobiography of Count Basie. You know, Good Morning Blues as told to Albert Murray, Blue Devils of Nada, a contemporary approach to American aesthetic statement, I think it's called, and a book of poetry, 4 novels from Train Whistle Guitar, which he worked on for a long time, and which I think may be his classic fictional work, to The Spyglass Tree, which takes the main character, Scooter, who we were introduced to through Train Whistle Guitar, and he's in college in Spyglass Tree. Then you have 7 League Boots, where the main character is now an adult, a young adult, and he ends up going on the road with a character named the Boss Man, and the Boss Man is kind of a combination of Basie and Ellington. He's playing bass. And the last book is, what's the title of the 4th of the 4 novels? Oh my goodness. This is not a good moment. Where is the name of the 4th book? Pause that for a second. Oh, Jesus. And his last novel, The Magic Keys. So he was a great writer, an original thinker, who, if he were better known and his work were better known, I think it would not only change the discourse and the conversation regarding race and take it more in the direction of culture, but it would also clarify things regarding the meaning and significance of the blues and jazz, not only in American history, but as a dynamic that really has been has had such a powerful impact around the world. I mean, just to give you one example, it was Murray who clarified that the blues, as such as he calls it, is about, a sorrowful situation, being downtrodden, that kind of thing. But blues music is not about that. Blues music is part of a communal and ritual practice that allow people to actually stomp the blues, okay? And he puts it in the context of, when you have blues music and you're feeling good and you're dancing and stuff, that's part of like courtship rituals and leads to a fertility ritual. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we can perpetuate the species. Yes. So that's taking it out to like very fundamental anthropological level. So a lot of people don't understand that. I mean, I didn't understand that in high school. I was like, the blues, it's like it's like talking about blues and slavery. I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to
hear people moaning. Yeah, right.
Right.
Yeah, and it's so damn fun to play.
Absolutely. And folks who grew up with it knew it's fun to listen to.
Yeah.
You actually listen to it to get rid of the blues.
Yeah. One thing I love about playing the blues is you can't get lost. I mean, you'd really have to try to get lost.
Right.
You can feel it coming around again every time, and it's
cycles.
It just lets you play without getting too distracted by trying to pay attention to complex chord changes and
Right.
all that. Although you can make it complex also.
Right.
That's why I think of it as like the blues is like a chameleon. It's like, let's play, we need something funky. Well, we can play a 12-bar blues as funky, or
Right.
whatever it can adapt.
Well, that absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things. Ellington and so many others.
Yeah.
You can play the blues all kind of which way. You can play it slow. You can play a stomp, fast blues. I mean, all kind of different feelings and flavors and approaches is there with that fundamental blues. And then it connects through like the pentatonic scale. It connects to music around the world.
Mm-hmm.
So the blues is so fundamental to music, to American music. And like I say, through the pentatonic scale, it connects to music around the world.
Yeah.
So then you have musicians who don't want to confront the blues, and you're in America, and you're playing jazz. If you play rock, you can't not confront the blues. If you play country, you can't not confront the blues.
Remember Muddy Waters said, the blues got pregnant and the baby was rock and roll.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, then, if the blues was in that anecdote or metaphor, if the blues is a woman, then the father would be R&B, because rock comes out of R&B, especially through the person of Louis Jordan.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh.
Who was jazz, R&B, entertainer. He had that whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, to wrap up here, what's your feeling about the near future of jazz?
The near future of jazz. That's a big question. When I was here, I had a radio show on WHCR. And my very last show, the very last 2 songs I played, I said, well, what's the future of jazz going to be like? This is like 85, spring of 85. And I said, some people say it's going to be like this. And I played John Luke Ponty with him with his guitar, doing something that was very fusion-esque. And I said, but I kind of would like it to be like this. And I put on Art Blakey with Wynton Marsalis. Yeah, swinging.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that jazz has flowered in such a fashion that, as Branford Marsalis once said to me, there isn't these days the shared language, the lingua franca, as there was at one time, so that you have these different strains, these different offshoots, where there's some people who are so much into complex time signatures, 9/11 and 7/8 and all kind of stuff, as opposed to, or not just as opposed to, but where straight 4/4 swing, maybe it's boring to them or something. But that I would add that to the avoidance of the blues, avoidance of swing, and this seeming need to go into all these complexities. But as Clark Terry, that great documentary, Keep On Keeping On, said to a group of students at William Patterson University, and Duke Ellington said once that something along the lines of simplicity is one of the most complex things that you can do.
It's not easy to be simple.
You're right.
And
So, but to answer your question, it's kind of hard to say. I can tell you what I wish. That I want to make sure that as people experiment, as musicians try in their definition of their own style, maybe in relation to a group of musicians that they play with, even a generation, that they will continue to look at the sweep and continuum of the history of development, know how to play aspects of that so they can always draw on that as they're trying to innovate or do something else. But, I mean, there's such a diversity that you find. So, I mean, if you want this mixture, I mean, there's folks from a South or East Indian background who incorporate Indian music into what they do. There are people from Eastern Europe who incorporate their own sound, and they should. They should, because that's a part of their own expression, their own background. But I would say, like in anything in life, you have your fundamentals, and then you develop based on your fundamentals. Know your fundamentals. If you're going to play in the art form of jazz, know the fundamentals and certain aspects of those fundamentals. Blues, jazz, 4/4 swing, Latin, because they have that Latin tinge. You know, there's a certain thing, being able to play at a variety of tempos, from ballad to up tempo. Learn how to play in before you play out. If you want to play out, to be able to play out, then that's counterposing what in is. So learn in first. You know, get your basics down and then go from there.
Well, you're a good advocate for the music, and
Thank you, sir.
this is obvious, but you know what you're talking about, and we want the advocates to know what they're talking about.
Thank you very much, Monk.
It's been a pleasure, and I wish you best of luck with your Albert Murray work
Thank you, sir.
and your continued entrepreneurial skills.
Thank you
in
very
the
much,
world of
Professor
jazz.
Rowe.
Thanks a lot.
You got it. Thank you.